Welcome everyone to this seminar series. I've been asked to introduce Reed for this because I was the handling editor, so that's the custom in this series is for the handling editor to introduce the speaker. So I will let you know, Reed Noss is a writer, photographer, a lecturer, a consultant in natural history, ecology, and conservation. His latest academic job was Provost's Distinguished Research Professor of Biology at University of Central Florida. Reed has served as the editor-in-chief for Conservation Biology, science editor for Wild Earth magazine, president of the Society for Conservation Biology, SCB, and also for the North America section of SCB. He's an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. His recent research topics include disturbance ecology with a special emphasis on fire disturbance, ecosystem conservation and restoration, road ecology, and vulnerability of species and ecosystems to climate change and sea level rise. He has a staggering number of publications, well over 300, including 8 books. Most recent books are Forgotten Grasslands of the South, 2013, and Fire Ecology of Florida and the Southeast Coastal Plain in 2018. He's currently working slowly on a book on the endangered ecosystems of North America. I do want to just add a short personal observation. I've known Reed for over 30 years, and I should note that he's been a self-directed force of nature. In most years, he's been working outside of academia and outside of government agencies. For me, over those 3 decades, Reed has been an example that helps me focus on doing good science, sharing it with the world, doing good conservation, and appreciating the natural world. And that's helped me focus on those things rather than job status. So I'm very pleased to introduce him today. And with that, please take it away, Reed.
Okay, Paul, thanks so much for that very complimentary introduction. I always try to live up to it. Thanks to everyone, and I'm very sorry for the technical difficulties that we had, but I won't spend any more time talking about that. I'm no big fan of Zoom, by the way. Maybe some of you share that. So I'll be talking today about the subject of a paper recently published as Early View in Conservation Biology. And I want to first acknowledge my co-authors, whom you see here. They include science staff with federal and state agencies such as USGS, U.S. Geological Survey, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, several state natural heritage programs, also several universities and NGOs such as NatureServe and the Southeastern Grasslands Initiative. So our goals with this project were several. The first was to explore ways to make species status assessments under the Endangered Species Act more efficient and effective, which is a major interest right now of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. A second goal was to determine science needs for species status assessments for a case study region, which is the southeastern U.S. with focus on the grassland ecosystems of this region. And then third, we wanted to more generally explore benefits of an ecosystem approach to conservation of at-risk species, which we feel might be more efficient and perhaps even more effective in the long run. And also we would hope would be transferable to other regions. So species status assessment is a relatively new process. It was adopted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service just a few years ago. It's essentially a biological risk assessment. It's meant to inform decision makers of the current and projected future status of species that are either currently listed under the Endangered Species Act or that have been proposed for listing. But we also chose to consider species that have the biological attributes to make them potentially listable and also face the kind of threats that would make them warranting listing in the future, even if they're not currently formally proposed. Importantly, species status assessment is a real umbrella process for the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's intended to inform essentially all ESA decisions, everything from listing and delisting species to recovery planning, critical habitat designation, and potentially other processes such as interagency consultations and development of habitat conservation plans. So it is critical that SSA be done as efficiently and effectively as possible. So all SSAs to date have been single species plans. There is no current policy support for multi-species or ecosystem level species status assessments. Now, I and at least several of my co-authors consider this a significant limitation of species status assessment in its current form, especially because there are so many species that are either already listed or are potentially listable. For example, some 1,721 US species alone are currently listed under the ESA. There are hundreds of species that have been petitioned for listing that are awaiting listing decision, and literally thousands of species, if we consider those that are very poorly known, and some have been very recently described, that are probably rare enough or threatened enough that they would warrant listing in the future. So our study area is a large one. I mean, we were originally calling this the Southeast, but you'll see that it extends northward to as far north as Long Island, as well as most of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So what you're seeing is basically the unglaciated eastern United States. So the northern boundary conforms to the Wisconsinian or Illinoisan glacial boundaries, or in cases where that boundary is unclear, which was true for several areas, then we deferred to the US Environmental Protection Agency Level 3 or Level 4 ecoregions. Now, the western boundary required a lot more expert judgment to assign the boundary line itself. And so basically we included all US EPA ecoregions that had a southeastern floristic affinity, meaning that their species were primarily derived from the southeast or more typical of southeastern systems, and excluding those that had more of a tall grass prairie, Great Plains, or Madrean floristic affinity. We also applied a very broad and inclusive definition of grasslands for this study and other work that we're doing in cooperation with the Southeastern Grasslands Initiative. So we define a grassland as any community where the plant cover, biomass, and usually species richness are concentrated in a graminoid-dominated ground layer. Okay, so that includes a broad spectrum from treeless grasslands to treed grasslands, prairies, grassy balds, a spectrum of savannas and woodlands with a range of tree density as high as 80%, as long as that graminoid-dominated ground cover is present, and then a wide variety of barrens, glades, and outcrops, which are highly variable, herbaceous wetlands, such as marshes, fens, and bogs, many bogs, as well, finally, as cane breaks, which are systems dominated by a species of the American bamboo, Arundinaria. Now, we're very interested in talking about and considering some of the factors that were important in the origin and the maintenance of these systems over time. Because basically, if you want to maintain ecosystems into the future, you have to know what factors and within what range of variability they were maintained in the past. So these are some of the major factors that maintain grasslands in the Southeast and elsewhere. Climate is important. Basically, especially in the southeastern coastal plain, a savanna climate predominates with distinct seasonality of rainfall, a dry season and a wet season. Elsewhere, microclimate is very important to the distribution of some grasslands. Fire is the most important type or most important factor across most of the grassland systems in the Southeast. Not all, but most. Some that aren't as requiring fire are those that are their distribution determined by substrate, such as unusual geology or soils, sometimes various landform positions. Hydrology is important, especially extreme variation in hydrology tends to exclude trees, favor grasses. Herbivores, especially mega herbivores, have been very important in the past and in some cases still are. And then there's a whole range of other disturbances and combinations of disturbances, and of course humans, which modify all of this. Regarding fire, I think many people will be surprised to learn that the southeastern US is actually the most fire-prone region in North America. We don't hear as much about fires in the southeast as we do in the fire-prone West. But in terms of natural fire frequency caused by lightning, for example, the Southeast is definitely the most fire prone. The highest lightning strike density of any sizable region in North America, and also a long history of burning by humans, up to 2,000 years or more in some regions of the Southeast. Mega herbivore grazing, in the past especially, probably was more important to maintenance of many grassland ecosystems than is generally appreciated. For instance, we know that there were a whole succession of mega herbivores using southeastern grasslands, and this is evidenced by the trails that still persist in some cases today. They were used by Pleistocene and earlier megafauna, such as mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, all the way up through bison. And these trails were called buffalo traces by the early Euro-American settlers because of the presence of herds of bison using those. And a number of plants are associated with these buffalo traces. Some of them narrow endemics. This is an example here of one of those narrow endemics, Solidago shortii. This was discovered on an island in the Ohio River where a buffalo trace crossed the river. It was subsequently inundated by a dam and presumed to be extinct until rediscovered by the eminent University of Cincinnati ecologist Lucy Brown in the early 20th century. But where did Lucy find this? She found it in a heavily grazed pasture adjacent to a well-known buffalo trace. So this species apparently is dependent on grazing to basically to reduce competition from other species, most likely. So now I'm going to give you just a few of the examples of the many different grasslands that we find in the Southeast. And I should say that none of this material is actually in our conservation biology paper because we just didn't have the space. It is in the associated USGS report, which came out shortly before this paper. But importantly, many of the science needs and research questions that we came up with during this entire exercise related to the basic ecology and natural history of these systems. So knowing something about these systems and the factors that maintain them is a very important part of, I think, the whole study and going forward to further conservation work. This is one example. It's one I've worked in myself. It was a dominant system in South Central Florida, historically covering about 500,000 hectares. It's now about 90% gone, converted to so-called improved pasture with introduced forage grasses. This is perhaps the most frequent fire natural community or ecosystem type in all of North America. The natural lightning fire frequency here is 1 to 2 years. We know that because some species have virtually no demographic success if fire return interval goes beyond 24 months. There's many other really interesting types, some of which are just outstanding aesthetically, such as the grassy balds of the Southern Appalachians. These occur on a number of peaks, and they're found really systems of this type in only a couple other major regions of the world, one being the Oregon Coast Range, and another being the Carpathian Mountains of Eastern Europe, primarily in Romania. There's endemic species in these communities as well. They were maintained, we think, well, they were created perhaps by climatic conditions, for example, grassy tundra during the glacial periods, but then maintained after that, the leading hypothesis suggests, by grazing by mega herbivores, which migrated up to utilize them in the summer. One of the dominant ecosystems, grassy ecosystems of the Southeast were pine savannas, especially longleaf pine savannas, but also several other species of pines. But longleaf pine itself dominated about 2/3 of the coastal plain prior to Euro-American settlement. Now it's more than 90%, 97%, I should say, gone. A variety of oak savannas were important in various parts of the region, as well as pine oak savannas. Here's an example of a post oak savanna from the Arkansas Valley in Arkansas. A number of types, as I suggested earlier, of edaphic grasslands. We do have serpentine grasslands. This is one example, Soldier's Delight, from a large complex of serpentine grasslands in Maryland and adjacent Pennsylvania. In the east, these serpentine soils do, because of their high mineral contents, sometimes in toxic levels, tend to exclude woody vegetation. However, they can't entirely exclude or prevent tree invasion without periodic fire. So it's a mixture of the edaphic condition and fire that maintains these. And these serpentine grasslands occur up to 4,000 feet in elevation in the southern Appalachians and as far south as northern Georgia. An even more extreme example of an edaphic grassland or glade is the Ketona Dolomite glades of Alabama, the very southern tip of the Ridge and Valley physiographic province. This particular type of dolomite has some of the highest concentrations of magnesium of any dolomite known worldwide, up to toxic levels. And so you see here very sparse vegetation for the most part, except for in pockets of deeper soil. And also, as is often the case, where we have these extreme conditions and also isolation, we have development of a lot of narrow endemics. In fact, 9 single site endemics have been discovered here since 1992, and I understand that more are in the works. It's not only the edaphic conditions, the soils themselves. In this case, this example here is shale ridge bald, the thin shaly soils that inhibit tree growth. It's also the exposure. These shale ridge balds almost exclusively are oriented south to southwest, where they receive the highest levels of solar radiation. And so fire might not be necessary in these systems either to maintain open grassland. A number of river systems throughout our study area feature these riverside or river scour prairies or barrens, where regular flooding, or in the more northern examples, ice scour, exclude woody vegetation. And in this case, this is within the District of Columbia along the Potomac River. Significant floods occur every 2.5 to 7 years, and the sites are dominated by the kinds of grasses that you would find in the tallgrass prairie: big bluestem, Indian grass, little bluestem, switchgrass, but a few hundred miles to the east. And my final example is, I think, a really interesting one and also a very sad example: the Hempstead Plains of Long Island. So this is at the very northeastern extreme of our study region. The southern quarter to a third of Long Island was unglaciated. It was a glacial outwash plain south of the terminal moraine. Most of this system was open, dry grassland, as you can see in the upper photo by Roland Harper. The bottom photos show oak savanna, and then on the bottom right, a pitch pine savanna. Roland Harper studied these as a side project while working on his dissertation at Columbia University, which is in New York City, not far at all from these Hempstead Plains grasslands. Only a few acres remain of this magnificent grassland type, which is really kind of emblematic of the whole state of grasslands in the Southeast. So the main reason that we were interested, and agencies such as the Fish and Wildlife Service were interested in this project, is that Southeastern grasslands and their species are of extremely high conservation concern. I mean, I've suggested, and I welcome disagreement, and there are some counterexamples, but I believe that collectively and in general, these Southeastern grasslands are the most highly imperiled ecosystems in North America, north of Mexico. And just as one example, NatureServe has been working with IUCN to develop a red list of ecosystems for the Americas. And for North America, they've recognized so far about 39 critically endangered ecological systems. Of these, 64% occur in the Southeast, and 51% are Southeastern grasslands. Also, there's a high concentrations of at-risk species in these grasslands. Fish and Wildlife Service folks have told us that about 60% of the entire workload of the entire U.S. Endangered Species Program is centered in the regional office of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Atlanta. The coastal plain in particular was recognized just recently in 2016 formally as the 36th global biodiversity hotspot. Now, if you're familiar with the hotspots concept as originated by Norman Myers and colleagues beginning in the 1980s, it's basically an irreplaceability and vulnerability framework. The good side of it, the irreplaceability side, is that a hotspot has to have at least 1,500 endemic plant taxa to qualify. The coastal plain had 1,816 at the time of designation. There's been a few new species discovered or described since then. A hotspot, though, the bad news is, has to have experienced at least 70% habitat loss. The coastal plain has lost 86%. But if you look at the lower right here, this is a map, a very recent map of summed range size rarity. It's basically concentrations of narrow range species, the lighter colors indicating the highest concentrations. You can see that the whole Southeast stands out, more than anywhere besides California as having concentrations of these narrow endemic taxa. So finally, up to the present study, the methods basically were a mixture of literature review and a structured discussion format of a workshop involving some 39 subject matter participants. So the focus here was on identifying the scientific information needed to support species status assessments for grassland taxa listed or potentially eligible for listing under the ESA. And again, we considered species that were actually not formally proposed for listing, but all species that were included as either critically imperiled globally, G1, imperiled globally, G2, or vulnerable globally, G3 under NatureServe criteria. Our process was basically, a format that we use for our discussion is called World Cafe, which I had never heard of before this particular process. But basically, it's a process where breakout groups circulate the separate tables to discuss topics. And the topics were what we determined as a group were the major threats to these southeastern grasslands and their species. So every group gets to discuss every topic, and a table host facilitates discussions and compiles notes from all the groups that visits the table. And so what we ended up with was a huge, like hundreds of pages of notes from all these groups. But the focus of all this discussion was to identify the scientific information and research needed to support species status assessments for grassland species at risk within this study region. So these were the shared threats affecting most of the species, especially the first four here: climate change, changes to disturbance regimes, especially fire, habitat loss and fragmentation, and disruption of functional connectivity, invasive species, predominantly non-native. And then we also had a fifth category of localized or sub-regional impacts, especially sea level rise, which we did not discuss in the conservation biology paper. Now, after the workshop, additional research was conducted by an ad hoc vegetation committee to identify NatureServe ecological systems and corresponding vegetation types within the U.S. National Vegetation Classification that qualify as grasslands under our inclusive definition. We also wanted to identify and link to those ecosystem types at-risk species. So anything basically G3 or above, vulnerable or above on a global scale. So the results, basically, as I mentioned, were hundreds of pages of notes. And basically, these were synthesized into a few dozen for each threat, which were published in the USGS report. And then they were further condensed into about 4 to 7 research needs and questions for each threat, with the exception of localized impacts, which is what we reported in our conservation biology paper. So these examples here are just some of the types of threats and questions that we identified in relation to these threats. identify through remote sensing and other means the systems that are most threatened by land use change, i.e. habitat loss, identify those species that are unable to shift spatially in response to climate change due to restrictions to particular habitats or locations, determine the evolutionary fire regimes for various grassland types through various means. This is very important because species in our region, as I've implied already, are highly fire adapted and in fact even fire dependent, but they don't require just fire per se. They require a particular fire regime to which they've adapted during their evolutionary histories. So if we exceed the bounds of those natural fire regimes, the range of variability for any of the components of the fire regimes, it's not unlikely that we will put species at risk. And that, in fact, we know has happened for many taxa with changes in fire regimes over these centuries, in fact. And then finally, identify ecological factors that differ between intact and degraded grasslands. There's a huge range in susceptibility to invasion among our grassland ecosystems. There are some types, for example, these longleaf pine savannas I mentioned previously, that are amazingly resistant to invasion unless there's large areas of soil disturbance, especially linear soil disturbance that lets in not only invasive plants, but invasive non-native animals such as the red imported fire ant. So after the workshop again, this vegetation committee identified some 118 ecological systems in the nature reserve classification that meet our definition of grasslands. So that's quite a few, as well as, of course, the corresponding types in the U.S. National Vegetation Classification. This group also noted that there are several ecological system types that are currently undescribed, but that they knew through their own field work and other research. So there's more work to be done to basically refine this list of ecological systems and US NVC types. We also identified more than 600 species, either ESA listed or other at-risk grassland species that are associated with these ecological systems, and we explicitly link them to particular systems. And once again, we found some lack of data here. Many species that people in our group knew about are not currently either not in the nature reserve database, in some cases because they've been recently described, or they've not yet been linked to many of our ecological systems. But still, even given the existing data, we found at-risk species to be associated with 94 of the 118 ecological systems. So I know, when people show these slides, you can't read them, but basically what you're seeing here is a portion of an Excel file that explicitly associates at-risk species with nature reserve ecological systems. And so also in blue are the links for each system and each species to the Nature Reserve Explorer database, which you can find on the web. So in this particular portion of this spreadsheet, in the far left column are Cumberland River Scour, Cumberland Wet Music Meadow and Savanna, Southern Appalachian Grass and Shrub Bald, and Southern Appalachian Granitic Dome. And so the species then in the columns more to the right are associated with these types. You can also sort these by species to see the various ecological system types with which they're associated. So in conclusion, and I know I've gone a little fast because I was trying to make up for lost time there at the beginning. Although species status assessments are currently focused on individual species as a matter of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service policy, we find that a species by species approach is not likely to work too well because of, especially in regions with large numbers of at-risk species. And the southeastern grasslands are just a classic example of biodiversity hotspots that have very high irreplaceability in the form of endemism and also very high vulnerability. And again, just as an example, Florida has the highest rate of endemism in our region. In fact, second only to California nationally, but it also has the highest rate of human population growth and associated habitat destruction. In fact, our population growth in terms of number of people added per unit area, per unit time is the highest in the US. So there's been increasing interest in conservation at the ecosystem level internationally because of its increased cost efficiency. And this is evidenced by, for example, the development of ecosystem red list in many countries around the world. However, we need to do a better job, I think, of linking species level to ecosystem level conservation. Conservation biologists in general need to do a better job of this. Obviously, species level conservation is still critical. Some species, because of their extreme rarity and threat, will always need to be addressed individually. Also, species of high ecological importance, for example, strongly interactive species, keystone species, will often need to be addressed individually. But the coarse filter of ecosystem level conservation, we think, can capture most species and will help us organize conservation efforts for multiple species that are associated with the same or similar ecosystem types. So even though current policy within the Fish and Wildlife Service does not allow for multi-species or ecosystem-based species status assessments, we found that research and planning at these levels, for example, by linking species to ecosystem types, will lead to improved and more efficient single species SSAs. And in fact, we hope that this work will lay the ground for a stronger ecosystem level approach in the future. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge our funder for this project, which was the U.S. Geological Survey Southeast Climate Adaptation Center, Science Center, and also the primary organizer, which was the Southeastern Grasslands Initiative, centered at Austin Peay State University in Clarksville, Tennessee, directed by Dr. Dwayne Estes, and also the USGS also helped with the organization. So with that, Paul, I will turn it over to you to field any questions and discussion.
All right, I will just invite people to unmute and speak. I don't see any questions in the chat box right now. Yeah. Well, perhaps one question that came to mind here, both mostly during your presentation, even didn't come to mind so much when I was the handling editor, is maybe, do we need an Endangered Ecosystem Act? Instead of just an Endangered Species Act, we're taking this ecosystem approach and making the point, valid point, that species conservation really can't occur without dealing with the threats like altered fire regime and invasive species that are impacting the ecosystem. Maybe we should be, I guess TNC informally does that, but
Yeah.
Should we have a formal way to identify and conserve these entities?
Well, I think so, Paul. I remember reading in a short article in Bioscience back in the 1980s, an article by Paul Ehrlich, who first suggested the need for an Endangered Ecosystems Act. A little later, during the 1990s, I actually drafted a bill which was submitted, well, it was almost submitted to Congress, called a Native Ecosystems Act, because I didn't want to only focus on those that are on the edge, on the brink, but also be sure we represent all ecosystem types, regardless of their current status within protected areas or other conservation areas. That never really went anywhere. There's an effort in Canada that hasn't really progressed too far yet that is going to try to do the same thing, get a bill up there to actually create some kind of Native Ecosystems Act. And I'm helping a group called the Endangered Ecosystems Alliance up there with that legislation. But I think it's needed. It's obviously not going to be easy. I mean, I was the first author on a National Biological Service report in 1995 on endangered ecosystems of the United States. And that report was basically sat on for about a year and a half because the Clinton administration was worried that Republicans would go totally wild over it. Oh, you're telling us now we have to save entire ecosystems, not just species. So, it's going to be politically difficult, but maybe if people see that many of our endangered species conflicts could actually be reduced if we focused at the ecosystem level, then maybe things could get better. I'd welcome other thoughts on that.
Well, this is Alan Weekly. I'll jump in. I mean, the species by species approach is just so inefficient, and it leads to a lot of absurdities. In the southeastern grasslands, the red-cockaded woodpecker and its endangered species status has sort of served as a management umbrella species, a conservation umbrella species. Not that it's an ecological keystone, but a kind of a management keystone species, because it's forced federal and state agencies and all to maintain fire regimes and so forth on the remnants of the longleaf pine ecosystem. That's helped support 1,000 or more vascular plant species, hundreds of animal species, including unknown species and so forth. And yet, you know, there's a bit of a move to reduce the endangered species status of the red-cockaded woodpecker to regard it as, quote, recovered. Well, you recover the red-cockaded woodpecker, you remove the kind of the management keystone,
Yeah.
and you have hundreds, if not thousands, of additional species that are now more imperiled and less well managed for. So wouldn't it make sense to really view it as we're managing and conserving the ecosystem rather than through this kind of perverse mechanism of we have this one widespread but imperiled bird species, which is serving its endangered species status is serving to provide the conservation for thousands of additional species.
I couldn't agree more, Alan. Thanks.
So I can't remember, are any of your co-authors with the Fish and Wildlife Service? I can't, there were a dozen of you, and
Yeah.
I'm just wondering to what extent you did sort of say that right now the Fish and Wildlife Service can't really use this approach directly in species status assessments. But I guess I would like some feedback from folks who are in the service in terms of what they perceive as a way forward. And I don't know if I don't know who's on the call or if anybody has any insights on that.
There's a couple on the call.
Yeah.
Yes, I could pipe up. This is Chuck Hunter. I'm not directly involved with listing decisions. I work for the National Wildlife Refuge System, but as many of those species that are being evaluated to occur on refuges, I get to interject some thoughts. And in the 90s or so, I was actually involved with the Endangered Species Program. And I always have found a bit of irony that the first purpose given in the Endangered Species Act is I'm going to paraphrase here, the first purpose is the conservation of ecosystems upon which endangered species depend, which does seem a bit counter to the single species focus that we've been forced into. So I have been a proponent internally of trying to handle multiple at-risk species at the same time that co-occur. And you can imagine, just like it's really hard to define habitats very definitively, or ecosystems definitively, or geographies definitively, the same is true, you know, with the species. But a lot of these species, while they may overlap a fair amount, let's say longleaf pine, associated, some are in xeric scrub, some are in marshes, some are this and that. It's not as easy as it sounds, but to me, I'm agreeing with the theme here that if we could take all the herps and plants that have been petitioned for listing that are longleaf associated, but let's at least try to capture those in a single document, because what we find, at least I find, that we, depending on who's in the mix for developing the species status assessment, we'll have contradictory information about what's good for gopher tortoise versus what's good for pine snake. And while again, they're not 100% overlap, there's a lot of overlap. And so anyway, I'm basically in agreement, but at this point in time, Endangered Species Program is so underfunded and court driven. That's why you hear from Fish and Wildlife people that we can't easily entertain multiple species because the court decided different timelines for species that co-occur. So, it's bureaucracy, but that's kind of one way to go. One thing I would comment on regarding red-cockaded woodpecker, I've considered it good at a large scale focus, as Alan pointed out, on the need to maintain open pine forests and have regular application of fire or some disturbance. But in practice, there are so many areas that support healthy red-cockaded woodpecker populations where the ground cover is just god-awful in supporting so many of the same plants and herbs and ground nesting birds that I tend to focus on. And so it's kind of an imperfect example.
Yeah.
Even so, it's been one that, without it, we probably would see a lot less open pine habitat. So one of my charges is what can we do to restore ground cover conditions to be more grassy herbaceous and less gallberry palmetto, not getting rid of it because it's a natural part of the system. And it ain't easy.
Thanks, Chuck. I agree.
So I'm just filling up time here. Please interrupt me. But this World Cafe approach, this is the first time I had heard the term. Well, I guess I've heard World Cafe never. It's just something out there in the ether that I've never paid attention to. Is it the sort of thing that you see as being useful in other conservation contexts? I guess what is the basic idea is you have some literature, people reflect on it, and maybe just give me the outline. What happens in a World Cafe?
Well, the participants come with their own experience, and then we sent a very detailed annotated outline prior to the workshop, and then basically discussions then are very focused on, in this case, particular threats. And again, we had several breakout groups, but they circulate so that each group discusses each threat and the science needs and research needs related to those threats. And so you get a lot that you wouldn't get simply through a literature review. For one thing, you get people bouncing ideas off each other. Mm-hmm. So it's one of those things that, it's actually probably, I've been in many workshops, and probably this World Cafe structure is the most productive that I've been involved with. I found it was very useful. It's important, of course, that you have a good facilitator who also serves as a note taker. It might be better actually to separate those roles, perhaps, in some cases, and we did a little bit of that. The end result, I ended up being the one who had to go through these hundreds of pages of notes and distill them down into something that made more sense, although some others helped to that respect. But in the end, as first author, that was my primary task, and that was extremely time consuming. It took weeks basically to go through all that and come up with something sensible, and then distill it once again from the USGS report to the conservation biology article. Mm-hmm. So that part is laborious, but I think it does allow you to have a wide range of ideas and concepts and try to narrow them down to the real diamonds that exist in there. So I found it very useful. I don't know if any other participants could speak up to that, because there may be some different perspectives.
All right. Well, with that, seeing no other questions, I think it's now 3 minutes to the hour. So I thank you very much, and I'll offer some virtual applause and thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks,
Bye.
Reed.
Thanks.
Bye,
See ya.
everybody.
Bye.